Lawrence Neal here. Welcome back to highintensitybusiness.com. This is episode 320. And today's topic is how to make better decisions in your business and life, part 6, with my friend and guest, Dave Smith, PhD, who joins me for a part 6 on this series. Dave is a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology and also has a deep interest in decision-making processes, which is what we are focused on today. Dave, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Lawrence. It's great to be back.
Great to have you. Thanks again for taking the time. So let's carry on from where we left off, shall we? So we're going to start off with diversifying your perspectives, considering others' viewpoints and experiences. Take it away.
Okay. One thing I talked about on one of the earlier podcasts was this idea of the outside view. And I think it's worth emphasizing that and maybe explaining a bit to the listeners as to how you can do that. A really powerful way of improving your decision making is strongly considering other people's viewpoints and experiences, because those situations facing you might be rare for you and very, very unusual. Almost regardless of what it is, lots of other people will have faced that situation before. And that's why the idea of taking the outside view is really, really helpful, because here what we're doing is considering what's happened when other people have been in that situation, rather than just considering everything through kind of our own eyes and the lens of our own previous experiences. But the problem is that in kind of implicit thought processes, like using System 1, as we've talked about, the outside view tends to be missing. We tend to look at the world quite understandably through our own eyes. So it's better, really, if we can seek to find out how others have fared in the same situation. And as a default, my kind of initial position is to be very skeptical of any suggestion that this time the outcome is likely to be different. And usually when we think about it, say in business or investing or in sport, often what we're thinking is, for us, it's going to be better than it has for other people. We need to be really careful. And there's a good reason why this time it's different are often considered the 4 most dangerous words in investing. And I would say they're quite dangerous in all circumstances. So, for example, we know that even though statistically most small businesses don't succeed, nobody who starts a small business thinks they'll be the one that's going to fail. They think they're going to be the exception. And we talked about marriage in a previous podcast like this as well. Nobody gets married thinking they're going to get divorced, but the reality is nearly half of people will. So, for example, let's say you're thinking of opening a one-to-one exercise facility. One of the most valuable things that you can do before you do that is to speak to others who've done that in similar circumstances, to get a useful bit of feedback about the problems they've faced and what's happened. But the problem is, humans, we're very good at fooling ourselves. People tend to believe what they want to believe rather than what is true, and that's an issue I'm going to pick up on a bit later in the podcast as well. So rather than just cherry picking people that have been successful, it's also very helpful, and I would argue even more helpful, to speak to people who failed, because we can learn from them what not to do. And those people can be hard to find. They don't tend to be the guys on YouTube going on and on about how, successful they've been. You don't tend to get many people going on about what a failure they've been.
That's the problem. There's a selection bias, right? So people who have failed at something are less likely to be public about it. So like you say, you have to really dig for that.
Yeah, and that's the key takeaway from all the work on survivorship bias, and as Nick Taleb says, something to the effect that the cemetery of failed restaurants is very silent.
God.
You go down the street, what do you see? You only tend to see restaurants that are open. Well, they've been a success. So you might look down the street and you say, wow, look at this. These guys are raking it in. Their restaurants are really busy. I'm going to open a restaurant. Well, the problem is the restaurants that have closed, you don't see them. So you need to be very, very careful. We can learn a lot from others' experiences, particularly their failures. But as you say, the failures tend to be invisible. So I think that's the first thing. I'm not suggesting that it isn't useful to speak to people who've been successful and that you can't learn things from success. But I think in life in general, you learn so much from both your own failures and also other people's failures as well.
Yeah, it's just so powerful. I was just thinking about, in practical terms, how one might be able to actually make contact with someone who's listening to this podcast. Maybe they have a young strength training studio, or they're thinking about starting one, and just so they can do their own market research and talk to others who have been in that space before, who may have failed or changed direction or what have you. And I was thinking, if they approached existing studio owners who have had perhaps a lot of success, I just wonder whether they would also be biased in saying, oh no, I don't know anyone who's done what we do and failed, right? Because maybe they're being myopic in a way. So it's curious to know your thoughts on how you might actually go about doing that. Maybe if you did speak to enough people, you would discover some who it just didn't work out for and go about it that way.
Yeah, I think what you need to do is consult a very broad sample. One of the problems I think with people is once you have a kind of sample of n equals 1 or n equals a few, and they're a very specific sample, like the guys that have succeeded, you miss out on so much. So sometimes you've got to do a lot of legwork. And if you want to have a successful training business, for example, then it's well worthwhile spending a lot of time doing that groundwork, doing the planning, speaking to a lot of people. If this is going to be something that for you is, such a great desire, then you shouldn't really have a problem with going, with really focusing on it in great depth, going into it in great detail before you start, rather than just jumping in at the deep end because maybe you're not happy in your current job or with your current role, and you get the rose-tinted spectacles on. You say, I love training, I want to open a gym. That's not really a recipe for success. You've got to think very carefully and systematically, and part of that process should be that you spend a lot of time trying to find others and talking to others who've been in that situation, where it's succeeded. That's great, it's not a problem, but also where it's failed as well, so you can learn a bit from their failures.
Yeah, this is so interesting because I'm thinking about it from my own perspective. Obviously, I have probably the biggest advantage over a lot of people in that, I've got this podcast, I've got the Hit Business membership, I speak to studio owners of all shapes and sizes. So I see a lot of the patterns of things that seem to work well. But even myself, I probably am more biased in paying more attention to the successes than I am trying to learn from those who have failed, or have failed on in terms of like a more how do you say it? Like that, maybe their business is more, is running well, but they have had failures within their business. So focusing on those and using that to inform our own strategy for our studio. And I think that's probably because, like many people, I want to remain optimistic, right? But then that's not necessarily as helpful or pragmatic in the longer term. So you've actually reminded me to pay more attention to that.
Yeah, it's that old optimism bias again. Humans we're hardwired to be optimistic about our own futures. There's so much research showing that people greatly underestimate their chances of getting serious illnesses, for example, and they greatly overestimate their chances of success in different endeavors. And that's necessary, because if humans weren't over optimistic, we wouldn't try stuff enough. And,
yes.
if there's only a small chance of success, but lots of people do it, somebody's going to be successful. But it's just you've got to think carefully whether in that situation it's likely that it's going to be you. And the ideal thing is that you're realistic in that assessment. The truth is we all have strengths and weaknesses. But a realistic assessment of those and a realistic assessment of your situation and the likely success of any venture is going to be really, really helpful. I'm not suggesting you're negative about it or get down on yourself all the time or think about the worst is always going to happen. Absolutely not, because then you'll just get sort of depressed and you'll kind of curl up and you never get out of bed.
But go on. Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
But you've got to be realistic. And the problem is most people aren't. They tend to see what they want to see in themselves. And as I say, they're too optimistic at times when they're trying to assess the outcome of a venture. And that's why also getting feedback from a diverse range of other people is so useful. And that's something we'll talk about a little later in the podcast.
Yeah. One thing you made me thought of going through this particular point is, you mentioned there about just the number of businesses that fail. And I don't know if this statistic is still up to date or accurate, but I remember hearing that, in the first year, is it 50% of businesses fail? And then within 5 years, those that the 50% that succeeded in terms of were still in business, 80% fail in the 5 years. So the statistics, the odds of actually building a successful business and staying in business for over 5 years are very low, right? And so, again, I don't know if that's super accurate or whether it's one of those kind of cliches that gets tossed around. But then I heard someone say something really quite profound, which is that out of that 50%, like most people shouldn't be starting businesses, right? So I think because entrepreneurship over the last few years, at least, has become very, very trendy, right? I think people like Gary Vaynerchuk have made being an entrepreneur really cool. But the reality is that most people probably shouldn't be entrepreneurs. It doesn't mean that entrepreneurs are better than anyone else. It's just, certain temperaments and skill sets probably are better for other things, and people probably have more success doing other things. And so I'm always a bit skeptical of that statistic around businesses that fail, because I feel like just a lot of people that go into it shouldn't be going into it in the first place. If you were able to focus on the cohort of people that are actually have the wherewithal and the skills and the motivation, endurance to be an entrepreneur, then I think it would be very different. So that was a bit of a digression, but just something I was thinking about when you were saying that.
No, it's a really important point. I mean, firstly, as I understand it, those stats in a general sense are bang on. That's pretty much where I understand from reading the business literature. And as for the point about people going into the wrong things and things that don't really suit their skill set, you're so right in this. I think this is a major problem. And one of the things, for example, if you don't have the patience and you don't have the interest to do all the groundwork that's required, then that business, whatever it is, probably isn't for you. I mean, I see this quite a bit in investing, for example. When you're speaking to not just investment professionals, but also lay people, retail investors, and I'm no financial advisor, but I'm passionately interested in the psychology of money, because it reflects so much of human behavior. It tells us so many essential truths. And it's so interesting. There's so many people I come across if you chat to them about investing and they're putting money into the stock market or other investments, and you chat to them on a very basic level, and it's quite clear they don't understand even the simplest basics of what they're doing. And you think to yourself, it's not really for me to tell them this, but they really shouldn't be investing anything, because they don't understand what they're doing, and they don't seem to have the patience to take the time to understand it. And and it goes back to this old thing of, that again we talked about earlier on the podcast. I think, people prefer, comforting, simplistic ideas than they do complex reality at times.
Does would I be right in saying, so there's that well-known saying that's like day traders, well, I can't remember the exact saying, but it's like, people that become day traders typically can't just beat those that just set it and forget it with like an index fund. So the former group are like, killing themselves, trying to trade all day and constantly watch the markets, and those that just let the market do its thing and invest their money and set it and forget it and are very well diversified tend to beat them on average.
Yeah.
Where I was going with this is, could this be the same problem with this type of saying or statistic, where actually the most people that go into day trading, as you say, shouldn't go into day trading and some of these forms of investing. And if you just looked at those who actually were really, I don't know, had the right skill set and again wherewithal to be effective day traders, maybe it'd be a very different outcome. Is that fair, or am I off base with that?
No, I think you are absolutely right. I think there's no doubt about it that the stock market as an investment machine very much favors people with long-term time horizons. So that means it's very, very difficult because of the wealth destruction that the trading costs will cause and the random nature of stock market moves day to day. All the evidence shows the vast majority of day traders lose money. On the other hand, though, Lawrence, the people that are doing all that stuff actually do provide quite a valuable function for the long-term investor, because they provide liquidity in the market. Because if nobody was trading day to day, it would be much harder to buy and sell, your shares when you wanted to do them. So actually, funnily enough, in one sense, day traders and long-term investors kind of sit together quite comfortably, because the long-term investors probably need those people that are on the phone yelling buy low, sell high every day, or on their computer now doing it, just to provide the liquidity. But I mean, it's for most people, trading's a mugs game.
So if you're listening to this and you're day trading, please continue, because you help Dave and me very much.
Absolutely.
That's really useful. So, all right. So is there any more we want to discuss on this point, or should we move on to the next section?
Well, probably just a couple of things. I think for me, probably the main thing is in terms of how you can kind of use this. What I always do is I start with the outside view as the kind of default. And then when I'm working, say, with clients as a sports psychologist, for instance, or as a psychologist in other things, I will tend to adjust from the outside view using the inside view of the client. Okay, so you start with the outside, that's the default, and then you say, yeah, but is there anything about this person and the situation that suggests that they might actually be different? Loads of people have failed at X, but is there something about this person that means that they might not? So I'll give you an example. So
Please.
if I was working with an athlete, okay, and let's say I'm working with a pool player, and they really want to keep performing at a high level into a relative old age, past the age where players would normally still be able to maintain that level of performance, because like in all sports, eventually physically you tend to decline and you can't maintain that level of performance, okay? So let's say I'm working with a player and they want me to help provide them with the psychological skills and strategies to help maintain a high level of performance. And I might be thinking to myself, well, actually, you know what? Rather than focusing on that, they're at that stage where they should be looking to alternative means of earning a living, because they're not going to maintain the level of performance for that long. It might not be realistic. And what happens is sometimes the client will say something like, well, hang on. They might say, what about, I know, Lou Butera, who was a great pool player at a very advanced age, or Fred Davis, who was a world snooker champion and was still playing professionally in his 70s. And my normal retort to that is, yeah, but how many of those people are there? The reason they're so famous is because it's so rare. But what I would tend to do then is adjust according to the inside view. So, for example, if somebody's biological age is much lower than their chronological age because they've been fortunate and they've looked after themselves, maybe they're very fit, their eyesight is still great, even though they're past that level, that age where we think performance would probably start declining, they're highly motivated, they've got all those things, then you might think, well, yeah, you know what? I can really encourage them to push on. They might have a few more years in them yet, which the average pool player might not. And in the same way, the people that are listening to this that are in personal training, I'm sure you can do kind of the same thing to enable clients to have realistic expectations about things like fat loss, muscle gain, pain reduction, etc.
Yeah. I'm just thinking through your last point there. Okay, so right. So you've got a client you could take, the same example. You could look at a personal training example where you got a client who is, maybe they're slightly older and they've got some what seem to be unrealistic goals and expectations around performance or body composition. And you might take an outside view based on your previous experience and knowledge of the science, and then you listen for that kind of inside view, their perspective, to really inform the strategy going forward for that individual.
Exactly right. So it's a good way of which you can come up with a realistic kind of view as to what somebody's potential might be, and the kind of behaviors and training regimes that you want them to do.
And I guess further to that, maybe it goes without saying, you would consider other people's viewpoints from outside of, other experts, their experiences as well does that come a point where there's too much input, or?
There can do, but I do think considering a diverse range of feedback from others is going to be hugely helpful. And that's something absolutely I was going to kind of cover later on, but we could cover now if it's there.
Oh, no. I see that now. Yeah, we're going to come to that later, aren't we? So let's park that.
Yeah. But it's a really important point you make, Lawrence. I think absolutely that you can and should consider others' views as well. Otherwise, you can get very myopic. But we'll come on to that in a moment. I think the other thing that links to all this is the importance of recognizing the role of skill and luck in outcomes. Okay, so we take our outside view, we can get a realistic view of kind of where we are by adjusting with the inside view, but then we also always need to think carefully and consider the randomness of distribution of outcomes and anticipate the mean reversion that we talked about in some of the earlier podcasts as well, because another bias that people can easily fall victim to is this narrative fallacy. Okay, and we want to be very careful so as not to misinterpret changes that happen, such as apparent slumps in performance or the kind of hot hand kind of idea like we see in sport, but people might see in the success of their business as well. And this can lead to suboptimal strategies being adopted, or you making changes to your business strategy, or even a client's training, for example, when it's not warranted. Because I remember years ago chatting with my mentor about this, and we were chatting about personal training issues, and Mike was saying, it's funny how that the muscle gains people make seem to appear. Funnily enough, I was chatting with James Fisher about this recently as well, about how sometimes you don't think you've done anything different, but suddenly you get much better results. And you don't know why it happens. Somebody suddenly makes great gains, and then other times they don't. They seem to plateau, and sometimes it can be, it can be difficult to try to understand why. But it's probably a fool's errand trying to do that anyway. It's probably better to be at peace with the idea that performance fluctuates over time, and being at peace with the idea that due to mean reversion in areas like business, investing, and sport, very good or bad outcomes tend over time to be followed by more average ones. So understanding that can make us more robust when things go wrong and reduce the likelihood of our expectations being unrealistic when things have gone well in the recent past. And even very experienced people can make that mistake of attributing success purely to skill, for example, when mean reversion might have played a major role, because we're pattern-seeking beings. We're always looking for those patterns and that narrative, even when there isn't any. And it's in psychology, it's I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but it's often called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy.
I'm not.
If you heard
Please
that,
elaborate, yeah.
Right. Well, the basic idea of that is it's based on the metaphor. If you can imagine a shooter firing randomly at a big target like a barn door, okay, and they might pepper the whole thing with bullets. Then what they do afterwards is draw a target round a small cluster of shots close together to make it look like they've been really accurate and hit a target that they were aiming for. And that's what we do as human beings. We often look for patterns that tell the story that we want to tell. And we ignore the kind of massive amount of noise and randomness in the system. And, I gave some examples of the narrative fallacy before, but I've got a couple of really good ones. Actually, they're not mine, from a book called The Drunkard's Walk by Leonard Mlodinov, who I believe was the co-author of Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time.
Oh, wow.
And this book is all about the hidden influence of randomness in human life. And he gives a couple of great examples from the movies. So he talks about Sherry Lansing, who was a boss of Paramount Studios. And under her, Paramount won Best Picture Oscars for some massive films: Forrest Gump, Braveheart, Titanic. And in that period, it had its 2 highest grossing years ever. Okay. But then after that, she had several leaner years where the house failed to make any big hits. So she had the indignity of being sacked from her job because everybody said that her apparent hot hand, that term again, had deserted her, and she got blamed for some real box office turkeys. But here's the interesting thing. In that situation, normally when somebody fails, we can't tell. We can't look into an alternative universe and see what might have happened if things had been slightly different. But in this case, we can. And the reason is that in the movies, films take a long time to work their way through the pipeline. So the films that came out of Paramount after Lansing was sacked were films that she commissioned and was heavily involved with. Yeah. So we can actually see how Lansing would have done in an alternative universe where she stayed in her job, because those movies were essentially hers. Okay. So the films for the next year or so, they were all in the pipeline when she left. So what happened then? Well, actually, and you probably guessed it, Paramount had its best summer ever with big box office smashes like The War of the Worlds and The Longest Yard. Okay. And these were films that she commissioned. And it was a simple case of mean reversion. And arguably, Lansing really was simply a victim of the narrative fallacy, that people were telling this story. She's lost her touch. It was a simple bit of mean reversion. If the studio has just done the best ever in its history, it's very unlikely that it's going to keep doing that, because tall trees don't grow to the sky. At some point, they stop growing. But it could have been worse for Lansing, because sometimes you get all your bad luck at the start. And that's a real disaster. So there was a guy called Mark Canton at Columbia Pictures, and he was really unlucky because he had his bad luck at the start of his career. His first major picture house he ran, and he got fired very quickly. And he got panned, really, for failing to distinguish winners from losers. But you guessed it, after he left in the pipeline, real losers like Men in Black, Air Force One, and Jerry Maguire, which were
I only watched those the other day.
Yeah, and they were huge hits. So timing is so important, but you never know whether the timing is going to be on your side. And it also applies when we look at investing, for example. If you might think, right, I've got enough money now that I can retire from paid work, for instance, yeah? You've worked it out that on average, the stock market returns that you'll get and the dividends that you'll get will be able to pay your way for your retirement. But what you may be forgetting there is that, of course, crashes do happen, and the timing of those crashes is important, because if you get a big crash just after you've retired and you haven't built in a margin of safety that says, well, if this goes down, I'm still going to have enough. The problem is, because of reverse compounding, you're going to struggle to build that money back up again, especially if you're having to live off the dividends, because as we all know, if your portfolio goes down 50%, it's got to go back up by 100% just to get to the starting point.
Yes.
And that's why a margin of safety is so important in our business decisions, in our investing, in everything. So when your listeners are thinking about, am I going to open a new gym, for example, they've got to think very carefully, well, if the worst happened and it did go wrong, am I going to be wiped out? Or have I got a margin of safety that I can bounce back from that? Because what you don't want is to be in a position where you fail and it's game over. It's always good to have, what they call a two-way door strategy. I know Richard Branson is a big fan of that one. He always says he never enters into a business decision unless there's a way out. And that's, really important.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think, because I remember when he started, is it Virgin Atlantic airplanes? He actually had a very low risk strategy. I can't remember the details of the story, but he wanted to get a flight somewhere and there wasn't a flight going. And so he basically chartered a plane and made sure that there was enough people, like he gathered a load of people up or whatever at the airport, enough people to pay for the flight to either break even or make a profit. But he didn't go and buy a plane. That's how he validated that idea. So it was actually very low risk. So not sure if that is a great example of what you're saying. But I do 100% agree with the idea of kind of planning for sort of worst and best case. In fact, you make me think of Tim Ferriss's fear setting strategy, which I just think is fantastic and something I've used a couple of times, where if you've got, I don't know if you've heard of this one, Dave, but if you've got a really important decision to make, it's like, it's a few questions. I'll link to it. I'll link to the fear setting strategy. It's a great TED talk from Tim and a blog post on it. But he basically gets you to ask like 5 or 6 questions about, if this happened, if your business went under and you had to, make ends meet, what would you do? And what it's quite effective, because what it forces you to do is kind of write down and think through how you would handle the worst case scenario. And that actually helps you, give you the confidence to make whatever decision you want to make, right? Or you've been putting off for a long period of time, and obviously starting a business could be one of those. So that's a little bit tangential, but I just thought that just came to mind for me.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It makes a lot of sense. You've always, got to be cautious. And, people talk sometimes, you hear people talking about the idea of risk reward, as if taking massive risks guarantees the reward. And I always kind of remind them, well, hang on, the idea of risk reward is that you take the risk and you might get zero reward for it. You've got to bear that in mind, and and think carefully about it. But it's funny as well. I mean, this whole idea of kind of mean reversion and randomness and the narrative fallacy, you see it a lot in sport, and I get frustrated at times because even sports psychologists who should know a lot better sometimes fall.
The Euros must be driving you mad. The Euro predictions.
Oh, it's honestly, it is literally. If you want,
I think of you all the time when I'm listening to the interviews, because I'm absolutely hooked and obsessed with the build up for the Euros. So sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say they do exactly this, and my students are listening will be chuckling though because they know this as well. It drives me mad when you hear these, the kind of punditry, and it is literally just the narrative fallacy in action. That's all it is.
Yeah. I'm hoping England reverse to the mean soon after two very, very unsatisfying wins in the friendlies. So I'm hoping we're reverting to a mean, which is gonna manifest in a 5-0 win over Croatia on Sunday.
Well, hopefully so. But
maybe I'm optimistic about the mean. I'm misrepresenting the mean there, but there you go. Maybe a 1-0 win will do.
Yeah, absolutely. But there was a funny one as well when the Mourinho got sacked and Ole Gunnar Solskjaer came in as the manager of Manchester United soccer team, where it was really interesting because that change was accompanied by a big improvement in team results. And as usual, you get all the pundits saying, well, it's because of this managerial change, and Mourinho had lost the dressing room and this, that, and the other. And the people that are saying that have never been in that dressing room. You kind of wonder how they know. But the interesting thing was one sports psychologist wrote an article claiming that this guy's a leadership researcher, and he claimed that this improvement was due to the leadership style of the new manager being more effective than the previous incumbents. But the interesting thing is, after he wrote that, the team's subsequent performance then underwent a big downturn, at which point most of the people who previously were saying this new manager was amazing were all calling for his head. And then performance improved again somewhat, thus averaging out. And so, I would argue this was a simple case of mean reversion. The performance had got so bad, it couldn't really get any worse, and therefore the only way was up. But then after a sharp increase, it went down a bit again and averaged out. Now, we don't know what caused that, what the specific catalyst was. And usually you don't know because you don't have enough information to figure it out. But it was interesting that even an experienced sports psychologist was, making these claims about leadership. And this wasn't somebody that was working with, for example, the club. And if it had been, it would have been completely unethical to be writing an article about the ins and outs of it anyway. But it just amazes me that people get carried away to the extent that even people who actually in theory understand about these biases display them so strongly.
Yeah, that must be so frustrating for you to see that.
It is. It's very, very frustrating. So kind of how do we avoid falling prey to misinterpreting mean reversion and changes in performance? Well, I would argue that your listeners would really benefit from using a robust, diverse range of performance indicators, both in their clients and their business, over a sufficient time period to ensure that they draw sensible, informed conclusions about the cause and effect or effectiveness of whether it's business strategies or training methods with their clients.
Yeah. And for those listening, they would have heard me and Luke Carlson talk a lot about EOS, which is the Entrepreneurial Operating System framework for growing and managing your strength training studio business. I mean, it's not just for that. It's worked across many industries, but it's quite popular within high intensity training businesses. And I'm a huge fan of it. I think it gives so much direction and helps with strategy and helps compartmentalize everything, keep you organized. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because part of the system is keeping a scorecard and deciding on some really key metrics that measure important things within your business, like, you know, how many free workouts you're generating, how many conversions you're getting, how you're retaining clients, and then how you measure retention, and keeping record of those KPIs and tracking them and keeping a scorecard over many, many weeks so you can really get a higher degree of confidence in what's actually going to work and what's not. And I think the reality is, Dave, is that, you know, 99.9% of entrepreneurs don't do this kind of stuff. And a lot of the time they're just kind of throwing as much stuff against the wall, burning the candle at both ends, working all the hours, just trying to see what's going to stick. And obviously there's a certain amount of that you have to do to obviously understand which activities are more productive, but you don't want to be doing that forever. You know what I mean? So it's just an insight which I thought was relevant to what you said.
It's very relevant, and I'm glad you brought that up, because although I wouldn't want to be accused of narrative fallacy myself with a business example of an N equals 1, as it were, with Luke's, you know, with Discover Strength, there's no doubt about it. When you look at the attention to detail that goes into that business, that goes into monitoring clients and monitoring the strategies and the thought that's gone into it, there's no doubt that is going to be an advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone's interested in exploring EOS, I highly recommend the book Traction by Gino Wickman, which you know, regular listeners will already know what I was talking about and may have already read Traction and may need to reread it. But also, I just want to mention as well, Luke and I put together a course called the Traction Series, which is, I think, 15 modules, which shows where Luke describes how to actually implement EOS in a strength studio business context. So it's really, really tailored to our industry, and it's absolutely fantastic, and I constantly revisit it. We've had great feedback. So if listeners are interested in getting access to that, please go to highintensitybusiness.com/join to learn about HIT Business Membership, where that is just one of the features you'll get access to. So I thought it'd be prudent to mention that.
That's great.
Cool. So, is there any more you want to say on skill and luck, Dave, because we've probably got time to move on, but if you want to elaborate on this, I'm happy to.
No, I think
you want to talk more about Euros, we can do that too, you know.
Oh, I'm always happy to talk about football, Lawrence. I've been going to soccer matches since I was 5. So although I've never really enjoyed playing team sports all that much, I certainly enjoy watching them.
Yeah, awesome. I'd be too selfish if we spend too much time on the Euros, because majority of listeners are obviously in the US and probably not massively interested. So I'll satisfy my own selfish needs off air with you, Dave, or maybe on another podcast. So next point then, proactively seeking feedback from diverse sources. What do we got here?
And this is something people really struggle with. It seems to be a real fundamental kind of block for a lot of people. I mean, we all kind of know that feedback's essential to develop expertise in any skill. But to make effective use of it, what we need to do is to overcome belief system defenses that we have, like confirmation bias, which, you know, as I revealed in your last podcast, is certainly one that I'm very wary of in myself, because when I don't monitor it and I don't take steps to avoid it, it creeps in. It's really, really difficult. So it's crucial to have people that you can trust, who you can turn to for objective, unbiased feedback, someone or people who are critical friends rather than cheerleaders. So people who will challenge you and insert critical and alternative viewpoints, but in a way that's trying to help you and not undermine you. So the classic example is the idea of a devil's advocate. which has been shown in some studies to improve decision-making quality. And the great thing about the idea of the devil's advocate, somebody to, push back against your thinking, is that it can avoid motivated reasoning, where you're basically trying to justify your own story, your own opinion. You're coming up
so
with
guilty of this.
reasoning that makes you feel better about yourself, boosts your self-esteem. And it's so easy to get caught up in that. So Annie Duke tells a wonderful example of how she became aware of this very early in her poker career, where she'd just come off a table where she had the most appalling bad luck. Everything went wrong. Okay, so she goes up to Eric Seidel, who was a big player at the time, and Eric says, "Oh, how'd it go?" And Annie starts ranting about how she was so unlucky with this hand and that hand, and the other competitor was so lucky. And Eric holds his hand up and he says, "I don't want to hear that." And she looks at him and he said, "Look, you may have been unlucky, but how is ranting about that, and how is that going to help your performance in the future?" He said, "If you want to talk about things you can improve in your strategy, maybe mistakes you made at the table that meant it more likely that you'd get a bad outcome," he said, "I'll talk to you about that all day, but I'm not going to be just kind of trying to make you feel better by kind of discussing with you how unlucky you were, because it's really not helpful." There's also a classic example of the soccer player Robin van Persie. I don't know if you've seen this one, quite a famous clip where he's talking to his son, and his son apparently was playing in a match, and Robin went to watch him. His son was on the bench and never got onto the pitch during the game. And afterwards, his father and son are talking, and the son's moaning, saying, "Oh, so unlucky, complaining about how the manager and the captain don't like him, and he was really unfair, and he should have got a chance to play." And Robin turns around to him and he says, "Look, son," he says, "at the end of the day, it doesn't matter to me whether you get in the team or not. You're my son and I love you, whatever." But he said, "The way you're talking, you're sounding like a loser. All you're doing is moaning at everybody else, rather than thinking about the things that you can do to improve." And it's true, luck does play a big role in life, and sometimes we are very unlucky, but dwelling on it isn't really going to help us very much. But as Duke points out, it's okay to have times when you just need a bit of moral support and you want to sound off to people because you're really peed off. And in that situation, you don't really necessarily want people to come back at you and be saying, "Well, you did this wrong, you did that wrong. Have you thought about that?" So what her suggestion is, and I think it's quite a good one, is that in your circle, in your feedback circle, if there's times when you just want to sound off, occasionally that's fine, and you need to make it clear that that's what you're doing. And that's okay if you don't want or need an objective decision-making analysis at that point. As long as that doesn't become the norm, and as long as everyone is clear on that is what you're doing and that's what you want, that's okay. But there's a problem when you're doing it all the time. When every time you lose, you blame it on bad luck or, the referee or whatever, then, really that's no good, because you're never going to learn anything that's going to help you improve.
This is amazing. Like, that is something that I think so many listeners are going to, be able to relate to. I mean, it's such a common thing, right? Like, sometimes you just want to vent, and other times you do need practical solutions. It's that kind of running joke between men and women, right? It's like men always kind of tend to default to the brutal objective feedback, where sometimes, I don't know whether I'm being a bit sexist saying this, but sometimes a woman might just want you to listen, right? And not necessarily give objective feedback, and vice versa, right? And it's just
I was just going to say, I've fallen foul of that one a few times with my other half.
Well, that's reassuring.
Yeah, it's so easy to do. Sometimes you think that they're wanting feedback, or somebody is wanting help, and and especially me with my background and my passion about problem solving and decision making. Sometimes I do it, and it's really taken it too far, and I get it. She lets it be known in no uncertain terms that that's really not what she's wanting, and that I'm not helping at that point.
I remember I went on holiday with a whole group of friends years ago, and we went to Croatia on a cruise. And one of my friends really fell out with his girlfriend, and he hadn't had a lot of experience in relationships, and he's come back to our table, and we're all sitting there, and he's like, real stroppy and in a bad mood. And he's like, oh, she's upset about X, and I'm trying to help her. I'm trying to tell her what she needs to do. And we're all just sitting there, three of us who have been in relationships for a bit longer and a bit more experienced. And we all just laughed and said, mate, you're going about this all wrong. It's like, you just need to listen and be there for her and stop trying to solve her problems. And and I think, it's my experience that they'll often make it clear when they do want an actual solution, right? And obviously this is just one dynamic that relates to what you're saying, but this is so powerful and so true. To like you say, if you want pragmatic advice and solutions, be clear about it, or if you want to just have a shoulder to cry on, be clear about that too. I think that's really good advice.
Yeah, very much so. And it's good then if you have signals and you have communication strategies that make it very clear, then that's so much easier for the other person to help you.
Yeah, and also, I just thought I'd give another example of mistakes I've made. So I remember, I'm going through this thing at the moment with social media where I'm really trying to figure out what social media is actually valuable and what's not. And I'll give an example so listeners might be able to relate to this. So I recently read Cal Newport's book Digital Minimalism, and he's very fairly anti-social media and would much rather have his followers focus on building an email list and working on their website and building on their own assets, as opposed to spending too much time trying to grow a business on social media and building someone else's asset. And obviously there's other issues that go along with social as well. And so I kind of made a decision in my mind that I would actually completely remove my businesses off social, right? Feeling that it was more of a distraction. And then, recently I promoted something on social, and it had just an incredible feedback and response on social media, probably just as much as my email list. And I thought to myself, and I almost wanted to ignore that data point, right? To what you're saying, I almost wanted to ignore it. And equally, when I went through this phase, this isn't the first time I've had this social media dilemma, which, to be fair, I need to actually create a bit of a clarity break to sit down and figure out what I want to do moving forward with data to support that decision. But quite a while back, had gone through the same phase where I was questioning the value of social media. And I had a friend who'd been literally going through a lot of training on how to do Facebook ads for business. And we're on the phone, and he's obviously incredibly biased, right? He is thinking I'm making a huge mistake and that there's so much opportunity. And I just didn't want to know, right? I just switched off. I got all angry and argumentative, and I was just completely irrational. And it's just so... It's understandable why I behave like that, because you just can't be doing with all the indecision and cognitive load of it all. But just this conversation with you, Dave, is really making me aware of how I can overcome some of these challenges. So I really appreciate it.
Oh, fantastic! I'm really glad to help, and because I think some of these issues are things that people kind of realize in the back of their minds, but unless you have specific strategies to deal with these issues, you kind of never quite do. It's so important, I think, to be open-minded and surround ourselves with people with a diverse range of views, but that isn't comfortable for people. We prefer people to, or often prefer people to reflect back what we already think, but that's not going to get us very far in solving problems. What's much better is to have cognitive diversity. It's so useful in team situations where you're working with your business partners and management teams. Social diversity is good and it can help cognitive diversity. But what's really important is having a group of people who think differently from one another. That's what's going to kind of make the difference. Get feedback from a group of people who approach problems and approach issues in a very different way. I don't know if you've heard of there's quite an interesting book on the power of diversity called The Difference. I don't know if you've come across that.
No, I haven't. No.
It's by a guy called Scott Page, and he draws a very simple but powerful analogy about the power of cognitive diversity. And he says that a good toolbox isn't the same thing as a toolbox full of good tools. Yeah. So if you've got 24 top quality hammers, the very best hammers you can get, and that's your toolbox, that's not going to be a very effective toolbox. Instead, what you probably need in your toolbox is a variety of tools. You need a hammer, you need some pliers, you need some screwdrivers, you need different saws, etc. Yeah, and that kind of seems obvious. But when you were working with others in decision-making contexts or seeking feedback from others, we violate this so often, and we so often end up with 3 hammers making decisions together about your business. And that's not going to be...
I did this literally last night. I literally did this last night. I had a decision I needed to make. I needed to talk through the situation that I'm dealing with at the moment, which we've definitely made some massive progress on, which I'm really pleased about. But I deliberately shortlisted individuals that thought like me, right? And I'm going to be nicer to myself. There was one I picked deliberately because he's outside the industry, and he's not going to just try and appease me. He will challenge me. And they all, to be fair, they're all challenged me to an extent, but this one in particular. So I did do well in that sense, but I just need to be better at this. I think we can all probably do better in creating a richer toolbox, as you say. Great analogy.
Yeah, I think it works. It works really well. And one of the problems is that groups, when we get together with others, that can tend to, especially when we don't have a sufficiently diverse group, or the group has a majority thinking one way. It doesn't have to be everyone, but it tends to intensify our existing biases. So there were some classic studies done on this in Colorado, where they had different groups discussing controversial political topics, and they had groups that were kind of 6 people in each group, and they had a range of views, but the range of views tended to reflect the place where the discussion was. So, for example, in Colorado Springs, where according to election results, people tended to be more right wing, and then they did it in Boulder, where they were voting more kind of for the left, and they discussed different controversial political opinions. But the interesting thing is that after discussing the issues, the group in Boulder had lurched further to the left, and the group in Colorado Springs had lurched more to the right. And what had happened was because they were surrounded by other people with mostly similar views, people became more confident in their own view, and it led to a polarization. Whereas the minority in those groups who didn't agree with them, they shut up, because it's very uncomfortable being in a small minority in a group. So rather than challenge them and reach a consensus, the groups actually got more extreme.
Yeah, and you'll see, obviously, you the last few years, you've seen that scale across a lot of the West, right? That kind of thing happening.
Very much so. And you mentioned social media, and there's no doubt that can be a problem with that as well. You know, people tend to follow those whose views they agree with.
Oh, that's absolutely, I was going to say horrifying. That's probably the wrong word, but it probably isn't an understatement. Like, it's worrying, I think, is the word. When I don't know if you've seen Social Dilemma, Dave. You seen that documentary?
No.
So it's a really good documentary on the downside of social media. Pretty scary in terms of its negative effects. And I remember one of the guests on the documentary was one of the guys behind the YouTube algorithm, which only shows you stuff on YouTube that kind of reinforces your own beliefs or it's content you want to see, right? So they're trying, obviously they're going to show you things that you're likely to click on and opposing views on things you're likely to click on, right? And it's really fascinating because the guy that came up with that algorithm is now on this documentary saying how bad it is, right? So he's trying to undo what he did in a way and trying to educate people on how they can use, different what you call it, web browser extensions to actually block these algorithms. And I actually use for YouTube, I use an extension which blocks like the home feed. It's just completely blank, so that when I go to YouTube, I just have the search bar, and so I can use it so that I'm not enticed by the home feed, and so I'm much more deliberate about what I search for in YouTube. It's a free, people listening, it's a free extension for Chrome, and it's called Distraction Free YouTube, like DF YouTube or something like that. So yeah, it's a great example of and obviously this happens across all the different social media platforms. It's just confirmation bias, right?
Yeah, very, very much so. Very much. Yeah. And I think it's great that these kind of tools are available to stop that happening, because it is awful. And you can see it in all kinds of things online with the advertising that they come up with and articles that, pop up on your feeds. And I think it's really important to try to, minimize that kind of myopia, really, because it leads you down a rabbit hole where you're only ever seeing a world that you agree with. It's like a world that you've kind of constructed. Of course, the algorithm just spits it back at you.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, and there is concern that people, and how true this is, I don't know. I don't know about the research on it, but I know there's a lot of concern that people are becoming increasingly intolerant of others who have different views from them. And maybe it's not surprising when you see some of these things that are going on.
Yeah, it is a bit worrying. I try not to think about it too much because me and my fiance have had a history of huge fights over over this kind of thing, political stuff especially. We're quite different politically, it seems. So sometimes I'm concerned because I'll be saying like, "Oh, you're watching this thing and it's just reinforcing your own beliefs. You're not challenging them." And I'm all high and mighty, and then at the same time, I'm probably having my beliefs reinforced, right? Dave, yeah. I'm really grateful for you taking the time today. Definitely going to need to wrap up there. But any parting thoughts? I don't know if you wanted to briefly summarize the 3 points before we close up.
Well, I could possibly. I think the last thing really is kind of summing up how we can avoid this polarization and encourage that kind of diversity of thinking, really. There's just kind of a few things to think about. I think one is one I think really good bit of advice is that when we're working with others to reach a decision and or examine previous decisions, I think it's really important that we never allow the most senior person in a team to disclose their view first, because that tends to lead to groupthink. So it's really important, therefore, that everyone is allowed to say, and if there's some kind of hierarchy, like like if you run an organization like Luke and he's wanting opinions from some of his trainers, for instance, it would be a pretty bad idea if Luke was to make very clear what he thinks about it before they give their opinions.
Lucas just listened to that and taking that to the bank. He probably already knows that, knowing him, but that's powerful.
I know. It really, absolutely. He doesn't need any advice on these things, I'm sure. But some of your listeners, it might be something just to think about. The other thing is, you should always be very wary of people that are too strident and too certain of things. And as Voltaire said, I think John Little quoted him in one of your podcasts before, and I love this quote, where he said, "Cherish those who seek the truth, but beware of those who find it."
I love that. So much.
And it's so important. And instead, what we should be doing is using a cognitively diverse group, ideally to form a truth-seeking group, to work together to make decisions and evaluate them. And it's so important that when we do that people know that their views will be valued and not criticized, that the idea isn't to be proved right, it's to find the best answer that we can.
Yeah, the best explanation, right? For whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, love that. What a great way to round this one off, Dave. Yeah, really appreciate it. I think I know I always say this, but this is the best one of the whole series so far, for sure. Part 6. And I suspect there'll be probably we'll finish with part 7. And we've got 4 more points to cover, haven't we? So I think we could probably do it in one more.
I think so. We can probably,
or maybe 2,
wrap things up in the next one. But I'm always happy to chat some more later on about this and other stuff. I've really enjoyed it, and I want to thank the listeners for the feedback I've had, which is fantastic and really helpful. And I just hope, that maybe there's a few things here that people can go away and try, maybe, that they've not thought about.
Yeah, absolutely. Best way for listeners to get in touch with you, Dave?
As always, for me, probably best in the first instance just to drop me an email at d.smith@mmu.ac.uk. I'll always respond to emails, and if you want to chat about any of this stuff, we can always set up a phone call or a Zoom call or whatever you like.
Awesome. And to everyone listening, to find the blog post for this episode and if you want access to free resources to help you grow your strength training studio business, please go to highintensitybusiness.com and search for episode 320. And until next time, thank you very much for listening.